What if I told you the most feared gang in America started behind prison walls, and their influence still stretches across the country today? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking rise, brutal crimes, and deadly power of the Arian Brotherhood. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because each week we dive into real stories of crime, survival, and power you won't see anywhere else. Watch, share, and join the community that uncovers the truth others are too afraid to tell. Under the fluorescent glare of San Quentin's cell blocks in the mid-1960s, a quieter war was taking shape. Not the kind fought with newspapers and petitions, but a survival calculus drawn with fists, shivs, and whispered loyalties. When prisons across America began to desegregate, men who had lived apart for years were thrown together into the same yards, the same mess halls, the same dorms. Fear turned fast into organization. Lines were drawn along skin and speech, and groups formed for protection became the only law some inmates would trust. Out of that pressure, in 1964, a handful of white inmates who had once been lone fighters began to brand themselves as something more than ad hoc defenders. They braided a language of ancestry and rage into a code that promised safety, retribution, and belonging. The name that stuck was the Arian Brotherhood. The Brotherhood did not begin as a nationwide crime syndicate. It began as a pact, a few men swearing to watch each other's backs, to answer violence with equal violence, to never break rank. Ritual mattered. Tattoos, oaths, and small ceremonies converted simple self-defense into identity. But in a system built on scarcity, of respect, of comfort, of control, identity became currency. The Brotherhood's code hardened into rules. No cooperation with enemies, absolute silence to outside pressure, and an escalating standard of commitment captured by the chilling phrase later rendered as blood in, blood out. That oath tethered men to the group in life, and for many in death. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the Brotherhood's muscle found markets beyond the prison yard. Drugs, extortion, gambling, and contract violence were all natural extensions for an organization that already controlled movement inside institutions. Where once the Brotherhood traded only on brutality, now it traded on networks. Guards who looked the other way, men on the outside who smuggled contraband, and alliances with criminal actors who recognized the Brotherhood's capacity to enforce without asking questions. The ideology of white supremacy that threaded through its symbols often bent when profit beckoned. Pragmatism and lethal efficiency became their true creed. Power struggles cannot be contained to a single yard. The Arian Brotherhood's rise was mirrored by the rise of rivals. The Black Guerrilla Family, Nuestra Familia, and other racially aligned prison gangs who viewed any expansion as a direct threat. Territory within and beyond the walls turned into a high-stakes chessboard. Assassinations ordered from behind bars, retaliatory beatings, and prison riots became tools to assert dominance. In some brutal arcs of history, murders inside cell blocks were the opening moves in turf wars that would later spread to city streets. Control of drug flows out of prison walls meant money, and money meant influence. Recruiters on the outside, lawyers who could bend rules, and a steady pipeline of new recruits who owed their safety to the brand. At the center of this evolution were personalities who could translate violence into organization. Barry Mills, later christened the Baron, emerged as a strategist who understood both the psychology of men in cages and the logistics of smuggling and extortion. Under his stewardship, the Brotherhood began to resemble a corporate crime family more than a ragged prison clique. Councils were formed, commissions appointed, and a chain of command reduced the chaos to predictable, enforceable orders. From his cell, Mills and a small leadership cadre coordinated assassinations and drug shipments, proving that incarceration could be the safest office from which to run a criminal empire. For the men who followed, the brand was now both identity and infrastructure. The federal response was inevitable. As the Brotherhood's reach widened and bodies piled up, law enforcement developed new tools to slice through the veil of secrecy. RICO prosecutions, wiretaps, undercover operations, and multi-jurisdictional task forces. The early 2000s saw the largest concerted strike against the Brotherhood's leadership in modern history. Coordinated arrests of leaders across prisons, charges that tied murders, drug trafficking, and organized racketeering into a single legal net. Trials followed, high-profile convictions were handed down, and some of the Brotherhood's most influential figures were moved to the nation's most secure units. The rhetoric of triumph that the brand could be broken proved optimistic. The Brotherhood adapted, splintered into state and federal branches, and demonstrated a chilling resilience. Where leaders fell, new ones rose. Where cells were closed, messages found new ways to travel. To tell this story as a single linear tragedy would be a comfortable lie. The Brotherhood's narrative is messy, a calculus of fear and belonging, of broken systems that groom violence, of men who chose brutality to survive brutality, and of outside actors who met profit with alliance. It is also a tale of consequences, for families, for correctional officers, for communities whose streets remembered prison yard orders. For every leader like Mills, who wielded terror with a strategist's hand, there were foot soldiers whose names dissolved into case files and graves. For every federal indictment that promised an end, there were retaliations whose echoes are still being counted. The brand endures, not because it is monolithic, but because the conditions that birthed it, overcrowded prisons, lack of rehabilitation, economic incentives for illicit markets, remain stubbornly present. This first chapter, then, must be rendered not just as history, but as a lived atmosphere. The smell of cheap soap and bleach in a corridor, the low hum of a fluorescent light, the nervous tick of a man who has learned to expect betrayal. It must trace how a handful of men in 1964 answered an urgent question: how to survive in a world that had been turned upside down by desegregation, and how their answer metastasized into a nationwide machine of violence and profit. It must not romanticize. It must expose the mechanics of recruitment, the rituals that made brutality sacred, and the slow, corrosive business of turning identity into profit. If we do this right, the audience will feel the thin membrane between order and chaos and understand why the brand, once born of caution and camaraderie, became a brand of terror. The Arian Brotherhood had been born out of necessity, but by the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was no longer simply a defensive clique huddled together in San Quentin's violent corners. It was a brotherhood that demanded proof of loyalty written in blood. Initiation was never casual. It was a transformation that sought to erase the line between the man and the gang. New recruits were not just asked to swear loyalty, they were expected to kill for it. The ritual known as blood in, blood out was more than a motto. It was a contract that promised a man's life was no longer his own. To join, you had to shed blood, either through a sanctioned assault or outright murder. To leave, there was only one exit: death. Those who crossed the oath found themselves targeted by the very men they once called brothers, a grim reminder of the irreversible path one chose upon entering the brand. The blood oath wasn't simply symbolic, it forged a culture of fear and control. Members were marked with tattoos that carried coded meanings: shamrocks, swastikas, lightning bolts, symbols that made a man instantly recognizable. Inside prison walls, those marks were both a shield and a target. The tattoos signaled affiliation, warned rivals, and instilled terror in anyone who dared cross their path. But it also tethered men to the gang forever. The marks were burned into their skin, impossible to hide, and with them came the expectations of violence, obedience, and silence. The silence was as sacred as the blood. The Arian Brotherhood enforced a strict code that punished any form of cooperation with law enforcement with death. Informants were considered the lowest form of life, and the Brotherhood used them as examples. A suspected rat didn't just vanish. His body often bore the signature of the Brotherhood's wrath, sending a message to every other inmate about the cost of betrayal. These codes created an environment where even the whisper of suspicion could be lethal. But power in prison was never achieved in isolation. By the mid-1970s, the Brotherhood began to understand that survival and dominance required more than brute strength. They needed alliances, even if those alliances were temporary and transactional. Their ideology was openly rooted in white supremacy, but when profits were at stake, pragmatism often replaced dogma. The Arian Brotherhood began to forge relationships with other criminal organizations, both inside and outside the prison walls. They partnered with outlaw motorcycle gangs like the Hells Angels, finding common ground in their shared hostility toward rivals and their hunger for drug profits. Even more paradoxically, they entered into agreements with elements of the Italian mafia, exchanging enforcement muscle for access to lucrative drug and gambling operations. The irony was not lost on those who noticed that a group draped in swastikas would willingly take orders from men of Sicilian descent. But in the Brotherhood's world, profit and survival always outweighed ideology. Rivals, however, were never spared. Among their most bitter enemies was the Black Guerrilla family, a Marxist-inspired black prison gang born from similar roots of survival and ideology. The clashes between the Arian Brotherhood and the Black Guerrilla family became legendary inside prison walls, bloody wars that left cell blocks soaked in violence. Each group saw the other not just as a rival gang, but as a direct existential threat. Murders were ordered like moves in a chess match, each retaliatory killing sparking the next. One stabbing in a yard could ignite a riot that spread across multiple prisons, drawing in dozens of men on both sides. Guards could separate wings, lock down units, and confiscate weapons, but the orders flowed regardless. The Mexican Mafia, or La M, was another formidable opponent. While there were moments of uneasy truces, tensions between the Arian Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia often erupted over control of the prison drug trade. Both groups understood that narcotics inside prison were as valuable as gold. Heroin, methamphetamine, and later crack cocaine served as both currency and leverage. A kilo smuggled in by a guard or visitor could decide the balance of power for months. When disputes over drug territory arose, the results were rarely negotiations. They were ambushes, assassinations, and riots. Nuestra Familia, another Latino prison gang, also crossed paths with the Brotherhood in these struggles, turning California's prisons into battlegrounds for supremacy. These wars weren't confined to the inside. As the Brotherhood extended its reach beyond prison walls, their alliances and rivalries spilled into the streets. Hits were ordered from solitary confinement cells, and gang members on the outside carried them out with ruthless efficiency. In one chilling example, leaders like Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham orchestrated murders and drug deals from behind bars, proving that prison was not a barrier to power, but a fortress from which orders could be issued with near impunity. The Brotherhood became notorious for carrying out contract killings for other organizations, sometimes even for groups they might otherwise despise ideologically. They had become mercenaries with a brand, and their reputation for lethal efficiency meant that other criminal syndicates paid for their services. The cycle of blood oaths and deadly alliances gave the Arian Brotherhood a dual identity, part cult, part criminal empire. On one hand, it was a fraternity bound by race and ritual, its members sworn to secrecy and violence. On the other, it was a pragmatic business machine, willing to compromise on ideology if the money was right. This duality made the group unpredictable and therefore even more dangerous. They could cloak themselves in white supremacist rhetoric one day, then strike a deal with a non-white gang the next. Their true loyalty was always to the brand itself, the shamrock, the code, and the empire of fear they had built. By the 1980s, the Arian Brotherhood had transformed from a desperate band of inmates into a syndicate that controlled not only swaths of the prison system, but also exerted influence on the streets. Their blood oaths ensured loyalty, their alliances expanded their reach, and their wars with rivals kept them feared. Every act of violence, every alliance forged in secrecy, and every whispered oath pulled the Brotherhood deeper into the role of America's most feared prison gang. Their creation was complete. Not just a gang, but a brand of terror, carved into the very fabric of the U.S. correctional system. Murder became the Arian Brotherhood's most reliable form of currency. In the closed world of America's prisons during the 1970s and 1980s, violence wasn't just an act of survival. It was a business, a message, a form of payment that could silence an enemy or secure an alliance. For the Brotherhood, killing was never random. It was calculated, deliberate, and often ordered from the highest levels of leadership. Each stabbing, each strangulation, each body found in a shower stall or cell was both a signature and a statement. The brand controlled life and death. The Brotherhood's system of power thrived on the fear it generated. New recruits learned quickly that loyalty was proven not through words, but through deeds, and those deeds often required blood. The initiation process demanded a show of violence. A prospect might be told to target an enemy inmate, a suspected informant, or even a rival who had slighted the Brotherhood in some minor way. These killings were not just about eliminating threats, they were about creating killers who were forever bound to the group. Once a man had blood on his hands for the Brotherhood, his ties to the gang were sealed. He had proven he could kill on command, and more importantly, he could no longer return to any kind of normal life without the protection the brand offered. Inside prison walls, murder was the lever by which the Brotherhood maintained dominance. If a guard attempted to crack down too harshly, he might find himself threatened by whispers that his family was being watched outside the prison gates. If another gang challenged their authority, a single night of orchestrated attacks could leave yards littered with wounded or dead. The Brotherhood's leaders learned to weaponize murder not only as retribution, but as policy. It was cheaper than negotiation, faster than compromise, and far more effective than words. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Arian Brotherhood's use of violence was the cold, bureaucratic way in which it was administered. Orders came from men in solitary confinement, written in coded notes known as kites, or passed verbally through intermediaries. A single message, often no more than a few words, green light on target, could mean the difference between life and death for an inmate. Once a green light was issued, the Brotherhood soldiers would not rest until it was carried out. It didn't matter if the target was heavily guarded, if the prison was on lockdown, or if dozens of men might be caught in the crossfire. The execution of the order itself was what mattered. It reinforced the perception that no one, no matter how well protected, was beyond the Brotherhood's reach. Outside prison, the Brotherhood learned to monetize their reputation as killers. By the 1980s, they had become the go-to enforcers for other criminal organizations who needed dirty work done. Drug cartels, biker gangs, and even the mafia contracted Arian Brotherhood members to carry out hits. For the Brotherhood, murder was no longer just about maintaining order within prison walls. It was a service they could sell, a commodity that extended their influence far beyond the penitentiary gates. In one federal investigation, prosecutors detailed how Brotherhood leaders ordered contract killings across multiple states, turning prison cells into command centers for murder-for-hire operations. The irony was stark. The men most tightly locked away by the justice system were using those same cages as fortresses from which to orchestrate nationwide campaigns of violence. The psychology of using murder as currency also hardened the Brotherhood's image among inmates. Every killing reinforced their mythology. Rumors spread through cell blocks with the speed of wildfire. A man stabbed 30 times in the yard, another strangled with a garrote fashioned from shoelaces, a guard nearly ambushed during a routine transfer. Each tale grew the legend of the brand, convincing both recruits and rivals that to cross the Brotherhood was to sign your own death warrant. Fear became their most valuable resource, and murder was how they minted it. But the economy of blood also came at a cost. The constant cycle of killings escalated wars with rival gangs into near-genocidal campaigns. Against the Black Guerrilla family, the violence spiraled into years of tit-for-tat assassinations that left dozens dead. Each side escalated the brutality, turning prison blocks into war zones. The Mexican Mafia, too, felt the sting of Brotherhood blades, as fights over drug routes inside and outside prison became pitched battles, fought with knives instead of guns. Guards struggled to keep control, but often it was the Brotherhood itself that dictated the tempo of life within the prison walls. The federal government began to notice. By the 1990s, prosecutors were able to show juries that the Brotherhood had essentially turned murder into a governance system. The group had become a shadow state within the prison system, where disputes were not mediated through dialogue or legal complaints, but through killings ordered with the efficiency of a corporate memo. This realization drove the Department of Justice to launch one of the most ambitious RICO cases in history against the Arian Brotherhood. Leaders like Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham were accused of orchestrating a dozen murders from within their prison cells, demonstrating that the gang's control over violence extended far beyond physical freedom. Still, the very act of putting Brotherhood leaders on trial proved the paradox. The gang's reliance on murder for power ensured its survival. Even as members were placed in solitary confinement or shipped to supermax prisons like ADX Florence, the code of blood in, blood out kept them active. Murder ensured that loyalty was enforced, rivals were suppressed, and the cycle of fear continued. The Brotherhood had institutionalized killing to the point where it no longer needed freedom to operate. In the end, the Arian Brotherhood's embrace of murder as its chief currency solidified its identity as the most feared prison gang in America. It was not their numbers, they never grew larger than a few thousand, that gave them influence, but their willingness to kill without hesitation and to kill in ways that terrified both inmates and the public alike. Murder was their brand, their signature, their product. And as long as there were men behind bars desperate for protection or criminals outside willing to pay for violence, the Brotherhood's business of blood would never run out of buyers. By the late 1970s, the Arian Brotherhood was no longer just a name whispered in prison yards. It was becoming something much larger, an organization with recognizable leaders, a command structure, and a reputation so terrifying that it spread far beyond the gates of San Quentin or Folsom. At the heart of this transformation was a handful of men who understood that brute force could only take the Brotherhood so far. To evolve from a survival gang into an empire, it needed architects, men who could build order out of chaos, who could turn a scattered collection of violent inmates into the Brand, a name that carried both fear and authority across the American underworld. Among those architects was Barry Mills, later nicknamed the Baron. Mills was a cunning strategist, someone who could read the prison system like a chessboard. Locked away for life after a series of violent crimes, he realized that the Brotherhood's real power wasn't just in numbers or knives, it was in control. From his cell, he envisioned a system where murders, drug trades, and extortions weren't random acts, but coordinated strategies executed with precision and secrecy. Alongside Mills stood Tyler Bingham, another key figure whose leadership reinforced the Brotherhood's grip. Together, they became the shadow commanders of a network that stretched across state and federal prisons, and eventually into the streets. Leadership in the Arian Brotherhood was not inherited by charisma alone. It was earned through blood, ruthlessness, and the ability to outthink both enemies and allies. Mills and his inner circle created a kind of council, a governing body that made decisions about who lived, who died, and which alliances were worth the Brotherhood's time. These men, despite living in cages, directed operations that spanned hundreds of miles. They issued orders through coded notes, secret meetings in exercise yards, or through loyal messengers who traveled between institutions. The irony was staggering. The most dangerous men in America were orchestrating national operations while locked inside cells designed to contain them. As the brand solidified its hierarchy, it also expanded its reach. The Brotherhood's influence was no longer confined to the prison population. By controlling narcotics smuggling and distribution inside the penitentiaries, they naturally extended their hand into the drug trade on the outside. Associates who had never been to prison became involved in moving heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine at the Brotherhood's behest. The profits flowed back into commissary accounts, legal defense funds, and bribes for corrupt officials who ensured that the wheels of the empire turned smoothly. This expansion brought the Brotherhood into uneasy partnerships with other criminal organizations. Though its ideology dripped with white supremacist rhetoric, pragmatism once again trumped purity. Mills and his allies recognized that cooperation with groups like the Mexican Mafia or even the Italian Mafia was often more profitable than war. In some cases, they agreed to divide territories or share in narcotics routes, forging deals that shocked those who believed the Brotherhood's racial codes were unbreakable. But to the leadership, business was business. Their loyalty was never to ideology. It was to the brand itself and the preservation of its power. At the same time, the Brotherhood's reputation for violence continued to grow. Mills and Bingham ensured that anyone who betrayed the group or challenged its authority was swiftly eliminated. Even men held in solitary confinement could not escape their reach. There are documented cases where the Brotherhood ordered murders that were carried out with chilling precision in prisons across the country, all coordinated from men locked away in high-security units. These killings were not just punishment, they were demonstrations, reminders to every inmate and every guard that the Brotherhood's control was absolute. By the 1980s and 1990s, the federal government began to recognize that the Arian Brotherhood was no longer a prison gang, but a national criminal syndicate. Investigators referred to them as the most dangerous prison gang in America, not because of their size, they never numbered more than a few thousand, but because of their extraordinary influence. Mills and his lieutenants had transformed the Brotherhood into a corporation of crime, with murder, drugs, and extortion as its commodities, and fear as its marketing tool. The leadership's ability to operate under conditions meant to suppress them made the Brotherhood especially dangerous. At the federal supermax in Florence, Colorado ADX Florence, sometimes called the Alcatraz of the Rockies, Mills and Bingham continued to send orders to their soldiers, despite being confined 23 hours a day. The very institutions designed to silence them became their command posts. To law enforcement, it was a maddening paradox. The tighter they tried to cage the leaders, the more resourceful the Brotherhood became. The rise of the brand under Mills and Bingham showed how adaptable the Brotherhood truly was. Born from chaos in the 1960s, it had grown into a multi-layered criminal empire that blurred the lines between prison walls and the outside world. It was no longer just about racial brotherhood or survival. It was about power, raw, unrelenting power that could outlast individual men. Even as leaders were tried, convicted, and locked away for life, the brand endured, carried on by the next soldier willing to kill in its name. The story of the Brotherhood's leadership is not just about men like Barry Mills or Tyler Bingham. It is about the creation of a system where authority could be wielded from behind bars with as much effectiveness as any crime boss on the outside. It is about the realization that a prison gang had transformed into something more sinister, a corporation of blood and fear, branded not with logos or slogans, but with shamrocks, lightning bolts, and the ever-present threat of death. The Arian Brotherhood story entered a darker, more expansive chapter in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, when it ceased to be merely a prison gang and evolved into something far more dangerous, a criminal empire that reached beyond prison walls. What began as a brotherhood forged in blood and necessity within the iron cages of San Quentin and Folsom had grown into a syndicate that controlled not only prison yards, but also major channels of drug trafficking, extortion, and contract killings across the United States. By this point, the Brotherhood was no longer just about survival. It had become about dominance, economically, territorially, and lethally. The metamorphosis began with the Brotherhood's recognition that brute force alone could not sustain power indefinitely. Violence gave them fear, but money gave them influence. In the highly competitive underworld of prison politics, drugs were the ultimate currency. Heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine began to seep into prison systems across California and beyond. The Brotherhood, already feared for their ruthlessness, took control of the smuggling routes, leveraging connections with the Mexican mafia and various outlaw motorcycle clubs, most notably the Hells Angels. These alliances created a pipeline of narcotics flowing into prisons, ensuring the Brotherhood controlled the demand. An addict behind bars was easy to manipulate. A fix could buy loyalty, silence, or a willingness to commit violence on behalf of the Brotherhood. The AB turned their drug operations into a system of extortion. Those who could not pay their debts in money paid with blood. A single misstep in a drug deal inside the prison yard could mean a brutal stabbing carried out in broad daylight, often in front of guards who were too terrified to intervene. As one federal prosecutor later remarked, the Arian Brotherhood had a business model where every deal was enforced by murder. But the Brotherhood's ambitions were not limited to prison walls. Through wives, girlfriends, lawyers, and corrupt correctional officers, the gang extended its reach into the streets. They established contacts with suppliers in Mexico and distribution networks in cities like Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Houston. Street gangs became pawns in their larger game, often tasked with moving drugs or collecting debts. What separated the Brotherhood from other prison gangs was the sophistication of its leadership structure. Orders came from a council of elders, veteran members known as the Commission, who orchestrated murders, alliances, and business dealings like mafia dons. Communication was handled through coded letters, invisible ink, and even hidden messages in legal documents. Violence, however, remained the Brotherhood's greatest weapon. Unlike traditional organized crime families that thrived on secrecy, the Arian Brotherhood thrived on terror. Their murders were designed to send a message not only to their victims, but to anyone watching. In 1981, for example, the Brotherhood allegedly ordered the killing of 2 members of the DC Blacks gang inside Marion Federal Penitentiary, a high-security facility in Illinois. The killings were carried out with such brutality, multiple stab wounds delivered in a frenzy, that the incident triggered one of the longest lockdowns in federal prison history. It was clear that the Brotherhood wanted everyone to know they could strike at any time, against anyone, regardless of how tight the security was. Their rise also meant inevitable clashes with rivals. The Black Guerrilla family, whose Marxist ideology clashed directly with the Brotherhood's white supremacist beliefs, remained their most bitter enemy inside prison walls. The wars between these two gangs turned cell blocks into battlegrounds. Each assassination fueled another, creating a cycle of bloodshed that left dozens dead. Meanwhile, outside the prison gates, the Brotherhood's expanding influence put them on a collision course with African American and Latino street gangs who controlled parts of the drug trade. Shootouts in Los Angeles and San Bernardino during the late 1980s were often linked back to Brotherhood-connected dealers trying to muscle into territories. The federal government began to take notice. What had once been dismissed as a prison clique was now recognized as one of the most violent and organized criminal enterprises in the nation. The FBI, working alongside state and local law enforcement, launched multiple task forces targeting the Brotherhood's leadership. Wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations were deployed to penetrate their ironclad secrecy. But taking down the Brotherhood proved difficult. Members operated under a strict code: blood in, blood out. Once initiated, leaving the gang alive was almost impossible. Informants were hunted down, sometimes even after being placed in witness protection. The Brotherhood had long arms and longer memories. Perhaps the most chilling evolution during this period was the Brotherhood's involvement in contract killings. For the right price, the gang would arrange to have targets murdered, whether they were rival gang members, uncooperative drug dealers, or even witnesses set to testify in court. In one notorious case, the Brotherhood orchestrated the murder of an inmate who was cooperating with federal authorities. The killing, carried out with a homemade shank in front of dozens of prisoners, sent a clear message: betrayal was punishable by death. The gang turned murder into a business, profiting both from fear and loyalty. By the early 1990s, the Arian Brotherhood controlled an empire that was estimated to be responsible for the majority of drug trade inside federal prisons. Authorities believed that less than 1% of the prison population was affiliated with the Brotherhood, yet they were responsible for nearly 20% of all murders in the federal prison system. Their power far outweighed their numbers. This disproportionate influence was a testament to the Brotherhood's ruthless efficiency. And yet, this empire was fragile. Every murder drew more attention from law enforcement. Every drug deal created more enemies. The very violence that had elevated the Brotherhood to power also ensured that they could never operate in the shadows the way the Italian mafia had. They were constantly under siege, not only from rivals, but from a government increasingly determined to eradicate them. Still, despite indictments, arrests, and even death sentences handed down to its leaders, the Brotherhood remained resilient, always adapting, always finding ways to keep their empire alive. By this point, the Arian Brotherhood was no longer just a gang. It was a symbol of organized violence in America. It embodied the dark truth that within prison walls, entire empires could rise, fueled by drugs, blood, and an unrelenting thirst for power. By the mid-1990s, the Arian Brotherhood had reached both the height of its power and the beginning of its most dangerous decline. What had begun as a brotherhood forged in California's blood-soaked prison yards had grown into one of the most feared, organized crime groups in America. Their empire was sustained by narcotics, extortion, contract killings, and fear. But now, the very violence that had made them untouchable was drawing the relentless attention of federal authorities. The story of the Brotherhood's war with law enforcement is one of escalating brutality on one side and unprecedented legal firepower on the other. Inside prisons across the country, the Brotherhood continued to thrive on intimidation. Every day was a chess match of survival. The gang's leaders, often confined to solitary confinement, still managed to control a network of lieutenants and foot soldiers who carried out their orders with ruthless precision. The rules were clear and simple: loyalty above all, silence in the face of questioning, and absolute obedience to commands from higher-ups. These orders included murders, dozens of them. The federal government later documented cases where the Brotherhood orchestrated killings of rivals, suspected informants, and even their own members, who had fallen under suspicion. Each assassination served a dual purpose, enforcing discipline and sending a message to anyone who might think about crossing them. But the Brotherhood's growing notoriety meant it was no longer operating in the shadows. Journalists began writing exposés about the gang, painting it as the most violent criminal group in the federal system. Television documentaries highlighted the white mafia of the prisons, giving the public a glimpse into the brutality that thrived behind bars. Law enforcement, under pressure to act, began to coordinate a national campaign to dismantle the Brotherhood. For the first time, the FBI, Bureau of Prisons, and local law enforcement agencies pooled resources to take down not just individual members, but the organization as a whole. The turning point came with the decision to use the RICO Act, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, against the Brotherhood. Originally designed to dismantle the mafia, RICO allowed prosecutors to treat the Arian Brotherhood not as isolated criminals, but as an organized enterprise. Every murder, every drug deal, every extortion attempt became part of a broader conspiracy case. This shift meant that law enforcement didn't just have to prove that one man killed another. They could argue that the killing was part of a systemic pattern designed to further the Brotherhood's criminal empire. Gathering evidence, however, was a monumental task. Members of the Brotherhood were notoriously loyal, and the gang's motto of blood in, blood out meant that leaving often required death. Still, federal prosecutors found cracks in the armor. Facing life sentences or death penalties themselves, some members flipped and became informants. Their testimony opened a rare window into the Brotherhood's inner workings, revealing a hierarchy, a system of communication, and a long list of murders ordered by the leadership. The government used these testimonies to build cases that stretched back decades, linking brutal stabbings, strangulations, and beatings to the top brass of the gang. One of the most high-profile cases unfolded in the early 2000s, when federal prosecutors indicted dozens of Brotherhood leaders on RICO charges. Among them were Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham, two of the most feared names in the gang's history. From behind prison walls, Mills and Bingham had orchestrated a reign of terror, allegedly ordering murders against members of rival gangs and even within their own ranks. The government sought the death penalty, a rare move against prison inmates already serving life sentences. The trials dragged on for years, with prosecutors laying out gruesome evidence of killings carried out with makeshift weapons, shanks fashioned from scrap metal, garrots made from shoelaces, even attacks using scalding liquids thrown in victims' faces. The Brotherhood, however, was not a passive opponent. Even under indictment, they found ways to retaliate. Witnesses who testified against them lived in constant fear, and some were murdered despite being under government protection. Defense attorneys argued that the federal government was exaggerating the scope of the Brotherhood's power, portraying them as bogeymen to justify harsher prison policies, but the mounting evidence was undeniable. Dozens of murders linked directly to Brotherhood orders left juries horrified and prosecutors determined to see justice served. The RICO trials were not the only battlefield. Within the prisons, the Brotherhood continued its war with rival gangs. The Black Guerrilla family, Mexican Mafia, and Nuestra Familia all remained bitter enemies, and each clash added more fuel to the fire. Violence escalated to such extremes that prisons like Marion and Florence ADX were forced into near-permanent lockdowns, isolating Brotherhood leaders in conditions described as worse than death. Inmates were confined 23 hours a day, allowed little to no human contact, and monitored relentlessly. Yet, even from inside these concrete tombs, the Brotherhood found ways to communicate. Coded messages hidden in legal paperwork, corrupt staff smuggling notes, and even invisible ink were used to keep their empire alive. By this time, the public narrative of the Arian Brotherhood had transformed. No longer were they seen as just a prison gang. They were labeled a terrorist-like organization. Law enforcement described them as America's most dangerous prison gang, responsible for an outsized percentage of violence within the federal system. One chilling statistic underscored the government's determination. Though the Brotherhood represented less than 1% of the prison population, they were blamed for nearly 20% of all murders in federal prisons. The Brotherhood's war with law enforcement was a battle of attrition. Each indictment, each conviction weakened their structure, but never enough to eliminate them. They adapted, recruiting younger members eager to prove themselves and ensuring that the gang's influence extended into state prisons and city streets. For every leader locked down in solitary, another figure rose from the ranks to carry on the mission. Still, the RICO cases of the 2000s were devastating blows. Mills and Bingham, once untouchable legends within the Brotherhood, spent the rest of their lives in solitary confinement, their communications severely restricted. Other leaders met the same fate, buried alive in America's most secure prisons. The federal government had struck at the heart of the beast, but cutting off the head did not kill it. Instead, the Brotherhood became more fragmented, with different factions vying for power and younger generations taking control. The war between the Arian Brotherhood and law enforcement marked a turning point in American prison history. It showed that even the most feared gangs could be targeted with the right legal tools, but it also revealed the resilience of organizations born in violence. For every indictment, for every death sentence, the Brotherhood found a way to endure. They thrived in chaos, and chaos was something America's prison system continued to provide in abundance. By the time the new millennium settled into its second decade, the Arian Brotherhood was no longer the unified machine it had been in the 1970s and 1980s. Years of indictments, solitary confinement, and targeted prosecutions had gutted its top leadership. Yet, as law enforcement celebrated partial victories, something else was happening beneath the surface. The Brotherhood was mutating, fragmenting, and adapting to a new era. Far from being destroyed, it was reshaping itself to survive. The seeds of this transformation were planted during the massive federal cases of the early 2000s, with legendary leaders like Barry Mills and Tyler Bingham locked in permanent isolation at ADX Florence. The Brotherhood's ability to issue centralized orders weakened. For decades, their structure had mimicked a shadow government inside prisons. Orders flowed from the top down, and obedience was enforced through fear and blood. Now cut off from communication and under constant surveillance, those at the top could no longer direct operations with the same precision. What emerged instead was a looser, more fractured brotherhood, one where regional factions and ambitious lieutenants filled the vacuum of power. This fragmentation was both a weakness and a strength. On one hand, the lack of a centralized command made the organization more chaotic, with competing factions often fighting among themselves for dominance. On the other hand, decentralization made the Brotherhood harder to destroy. Federal authorities could no longer aim at a single head of the snake. Instead, the gang's influence spread like wildfire, smaller, more localized, but still deadly. Each prison yard became its own theater of power, governed by whichever Brotherhood leaders held sway in that region. Outside prison walls, the Brotherhood's evolution was even more alarming. While its origins were deeply tied to incarceration, the gang increasingly operated like a hybrid organization, part prison gang, part street cartel. Released members, or those working through relatives and associates on the outside, became conduits for drug trafficking operations. Methamphetamine in particular became the Brotherhood's lifeblood. With ties to Mexican suppliers and biker gangs such as the Hells Angels, the Arian Brotherhood transformed into a player in the meth trade that spread across the rural South and Midwest. In towns from Oklahoma to Kentucky, Brotherhood-affiliated dealers pushed meth into communities, using the same brutal enforcement tactics perfected inside prison walls. Debts were collected with beatings, robberies, and sometimes executions. But the Brotherhood's racial ideology, while still present, began to shift in its role. In the early decades, white supremacy had been a rallying cry, a way to unify members under a shared identity. By the 2010s, ideology took a backseat to profit. Brotherhood factions sometimes struck temporary alliances with Latino or black gangs when business demanded it. Money had always been power, and for the modern Brotherhood, narcotics profits outweighed racial purity. This shift created tension among older, ideologically rigid members and younger, more pragmatic recruits, but it also ensured the gang's survival in an era where the drug economy ruled everything. At the same time, law enforcement pressure never eased. Federal prosecutors continued to pursue RICO indictments, and task forces tracked the Brotherhood's movements into street-level operations. In 2012, a major crackdown in Texas revealed just how entrenched the Brotherhood had become in meth distribution networks, with dozens of members and associates arrested. Similar cases in Oklahoma, Missouri, and California exposed the same pattern. Brotherhood factions running drugs, orchestrating robberies, and carrying out violent assaults to maintain dominance. Each case underscored the gang's adaptability. Even as leaders rotted in solitary confinement, the machine kept running, fueled by younger members, eager to prove themselves through blood. Violence, as always, remained central to the Brotherhood's culture. Initiation rituals in the 2010s were as brutal as ever, often requiring a prospective member to carry out a hit or participate in a savage assault to prove loyalty. Inside prisons, Brotherhood members continued to dominate through intimidation. Inmates who refused to join sometimes found themselves stabbed in showers or beaten in exercise yards. Even in the highly monitored environment of modern maximum security prisons, Brotherhood members demonstrated a chilling ability to improvise weapons and carry out killings in seconds. The message was clear: the Brotherhood might be fragmented, but it was still lethal. Perhaps the most striking change during this era was the Brotherhood's growing influence in state prison systems beyond California. What had once been a West Coast phenomenon now spread nationwide. Prisons in Texas, Arizona, and the federal system became breeding grounds for Brotherhood factions. In some cases, rival white gangs such as the Nazi lowriders or Public Enemy No. 1 were absorbed into the Brotherhood's orbit, either through alliances or forced submission. In others, they clashed violently, leading to bloody riots that reminded everyone that prison politics were never static. Technology, too, altered the Brotherhood's operations. Smuggled cell phones became tools for coordination, allowing leaders locked in solitary confinement to communicate with outside associates. Encrypted messaging apps, burner phones, and even social media provided new channels for organizing drug deals and ordering hits. Law enforcement struggled to keep pace as the old methods of intercepting coded letters gave way to a digital battlefield where the Brotherhood adapted quickly. By the mid-2010s, journalists and criminologists debated whether the Arian Brotherhood had peaked or was simply evolving into something harder to define. On one hand, its mythic reputation had been scarred by federal prosecutions and the visible decay of its old guard. On the other hand, its influence persisted and in some regions even expanded. For many younger inmates, joining the Brotherhood still meant protection, power, and access to drugs. For older members, it meant clinging to a legacy built on decades of bloodshed. What remained undeniable was the Brotherhood's resilience. Time and again, authorities declared the gang crippled, only to watch it resurface in new forms. Its story was less one of uninterrupted strength and more one of ruthless adaptation. In the chaos of America's overcrowded and violent prison system, the Brotherhood thrived because it was willing to evolve. Whether through ideology or profit, through centralized control or fractured factions, the gang always found a way to maintain relevance. By the close of the 2010s, the Arian Brotherhood stood as a paradox. Weakened but undefeated, fractured but enduring. It was no longer the tightly controlled syndicate of the past, but neither was it a relic. Instead, it existed in a constant state of mutation, a shape-shifting predator that adapted to survive in the ever-changing ecosystem of crime and punishment. The government's war had scarred it deeply, but the Brotherhood's story was far from over. In many ways, it had entered a new era, one where its influence was harder to measure, but no less real, and its violence remained as shocking and uncompromising as ever. The Arian Brotherhood in 2025 is a study in contradictions, simultaneously infamous and obscure, feared yet diminished, a relic of the past and a living, evolving criminal force. Its legacy is a tapestry woven from decades of violence, ideology, and adaptability. Though the gang's golden era of centralized power may have ended decades ago, the brand it created endures, leaving a mark on America's prison system, street gangs, and popular imagination. Understanding the Brotherhood today requires separating myth from reality and examining how an organization born in the shadows of California's prisons became a national symbol of organized brutality. Inside the nation's most secure prisons, the Brotherhood still commands respect and terror. While the hierarchy is no longer as unified as it once was under Barry Mills or Tyler Bingham, the organization survives through decentralized cells. Inmates in federal penitentiaries like USP Tucson, FCI Lompoc, and even ADX Florence continue to swear allegiance to the brand, often tattooing themselves with shamrocks, swastikas, and lightning bolts as outward signs of loyalty. These symbols, etched into skin through hours of painful needlework, communicate a simple but terrifying truth. A member of the Arian Brotherhood is bound for life, and crossing the brand is a death sentence. For younger inmates, initiation often still involves violence, sometimes murder, continuing a grim tradition that stretches back more than half a century. Outside prison, the Brotherhood's influence is harder to quantify, but no less real. Factions and associates operate in rural towns and urban centers, often participating in drug trafficking, extortion, and contract killings. Unlike the tightly controlled empire of the 1980s, today's Brotherhood operates more like a franchise. Local cells exercise a degree of autonomy, making decisions based on survival and opportunity rather than centralized orders. This decentralized model makes the gang resilient. Shutting down one faction does little to stop another from flourishing elsewhere. It is a survival mechanism forged from decades of law enforcement pressure, indictments, and RICO prosecutions that decapitated the leadership, but could not eradicate the organization entirely. The Arian Brotherhood's reputation, however, has always been larger than its numbers. At its peak, the gang numbered in the low thousands, yet it commanded influence far beyond its membership. Even today, the mythos surrounding the Brotherhood contributes to its power. New inmates hear stories of legendary leaders, unspeakable acts of violence, and carefully orchestrated murders, creating an aura of invincibility. In reality, the gang's current strength is limited compared to its heyday, but perception is everything in prison politics. Fear remains the Brotherhood's most potent weapon, and even a rumor of its reach can keep rivals at bay and new recruits compliant. Media portrayals, books, and documentaries have only amplified this mythic quality. Tales of the Brotherhood's brutality, often sensationalized, have cemented its image as the most violent and organized prison gang in the United States. Yet insiders know a more nuanced reality. The Brotherhood today faces the same challenges that beset any long-lived criminal organization: fragmentation, law enforcement scrutiny, and the struggle to maintain loyalty in a system that constantly moves, monitors, and isolates its members. Still, the gang persists, partly because of its ability to adapt, and partly because the very chaos of the US prison system provides fertile ground for its survival. One of the most significant aspects of the Brotherhood's contemporary legacy is its influence on other gangs. Many white supremacist and prison gangs have adopted elements of the Brotherhood's culture, from initiation rituals to coded communication systems. The brand has become a blueprint for survival and power inside prison walls. Even gangs that are nominally rivals respect the Brotherhood's methods and history, acknowledging that the brand's combination of terror, discipline, and organizational savvy is unmatched. In this sense, the Arian Brotherhood's reach extends far beyond its own membership. It has shaped the strategies and cultures of other groups in the US correctional system. Yet, the Brotherhood's evolution has not been without cost. Federal crackdowns, RICO prosecutions, and the imprisonment of senior leaders have permanently altered its structure. What once functioned as a cohesive organization is now a network of smaller cells, sometimes competing for influence. Interfactional violence has increased as ambitious members vie for control, and law enforcement continues to monitor and disrupt operations. Nevertheless, the adaptability that allowed the Brotherhood to survive decades of arrests and killings remains its greatest strength. In terms of cultural impact, the Brotherhood has become emblematic of the darkest aspects of the American prison system. It illustrates how violence can be institutionalized, how fear can be monetized, and how loyalty can be enforced through blood. Scholars and journalists often cite the Brotherhood as a case study in organized crime, white supremacist ideology, and the unintended consequences of mass incarceration. Its story highlights the tension between law enforcement efforts to control prisons and the ability of criminal organizations to exploit systemic weaknesses. As of 2025, the Arian Brotherhood is not the all-powerful syndicate it once was, but it is far from extinct. Its members continue to operate in prisons and on the streets, adapting to a new era of surveillance, criminal enterprise, and shifting alliances. Its influence is visible in the way other gangs organize, in the myths told to new inmates, and in the lingering fear that the name Arian Brotherhood still inspires. The gang's survival is a testament to its adaptability, ruthlessness, and the enduring power of symbols, loyalty, and violence. Ultimately, the Arian Brotherhood's legacy is one of paradox. It is both diminished and influential, fragmented yet cohesive in its culture, historical yet enduring in its operations. Its story is a warning of how an organization forged in necessity and violence can evolve into a criminal empire that defies eradication. And as long as the prison system provides fertile ground for fear, loyalty, and survival, the brand will endure, leaving an indelible mark on America's underworld, a living reminder that some legacies are written not in ink, but in blood.